We head to Chicago for the annual meeting of the Illinois Association of School Boards and attend a panel with Kim Maisch, the state director of the National Federation of Independent Business, and State Representative Lou Lang, as the two discuss the effects of the current budget impasse on the economy and education, as well as their thoughts on Governor Rauner's turnaround agenda. This runs about 1 hour.
Thank you very much. My name's Kim Maisch, as Susan said, and I drove up from Springfield today, and the roads really did stink, but I'm glad to be here. Susan said I am the state director for a group called the NFIB. I've been with NFIB for about 17 years, lobbying on small business issues. We're a little bit unique from other business groups in a couple of ways. We only represent small business, so publicly traded corporations like the Caterpillars or the Marriotts of the world, they can't be members even if they wanted to be. So unlike a Chamber of Commerce, we really do represent a smaller segment of the business community. On average, in Illinois, our average member has about 10 employees. And so again, we really do, if you look around your communities and your neighborhoods, the local bookstores that are still in existence, the pharmacies, the auto mechanics, many of those types of businesses are members of the NFIB. We're also unique in that we like to say, you know, I'm not a small business owner, so I don't always know what legislative or what proposals might work to help small business owners succeed in this state. And so every year we do a ballot to our membership and we pose a variety of questions. We give a proponent view and an opponent view, and we ask our members to vote. For instance, you know, minimum wage is a hot topic, or maybe perhaps prevailing wage, or taxes. And so we give a background, and again, ask our members to vote. And so when we do go to the Illinois Capitol, or we go to the Capitol in Washington, D.C., and we say we're here on behalf of small business owners, it's true. You know, we don't sit in a room with 4 people and decide an agenda. We try to understand who we represent and try to be their voice in every state capital across the United States. And the third way we're unique is, again, that we are one organization. So we lobby in Washington, D.C. and every state capital. And unlike most groups, for instance, chambers of commerce, you have to join your local chamber, you have to join the state chamber, you have to join the U.S. chamber. We're just one organization. And so Susan asked me originally to come and talk a little bit about sort of the last decade or so, some of the issues that we've been dealing with, because not surprisingly, a lot of the issues that my members deal with are issues that many of you struggle with in your communities. And so I came prepared to talk about minimum wage, prevailing wage, workers' compensation, and then unfortunately Senator Brady was stuck in another state, a much warmer state, I'm quite sure. So I'm also going to just touch a little bit on Governor Rauner's turnaround agenda and why the NFIB supports that. And certainly Representative Lou Lang will do a very good job, I'm sure, of representing the opposite side of that issue. So minimum wage. We have raised the Illinois minimum wage 6 times since 2003. We are one of the highest minimum wages in the Midwest. As we've seen now, many communities, in some cases municipalities, have raised minimum wages beyond their state level. Chicago's a great example. Of course, Chicago passed an ordinance last fall or last winter raising their minimum wage to $13 an hour. And we certainly have legislation pending in Springfield that sort of runs the gamut. We've got one proposal that would raise it to $10.65, and I believe one proposal would raise it all the way to $15. And so, of course, minimum wage has been a contentious issue since I can remember, since I've been lobbying for NFIB. Small business owners are very independent, and they don't like to be told what to do, particularly by government. And in many cases, over the last decade or so, the marketplace has sort of taken care of it. I mean, I can remember a time when my members, when I would talk to them about minimum wage, are like, who cares? I pay well beyond minimum wage. Because the marketplace took care of it, right? There was demand. But then we went through the Great Recession. And we started to see a lot of my members panic a little bit, trying to meet not only those wage mandates, but also a lot of the other mandates that government puts down on them. And again, I know those are all issues you're familiar with. Regulations that sort of get in the way sometimes of business owners being able to succeed and grow their business. Governor Rauner has agreed to raising the minimum wage as part of his turnaround agenda. I believe it's a quarter over 7 years, so 25 cents over 7 years. That is what he has put in his package, which I'm sure is subject, as everything is, to negotiation. So again, minimum wage is an issue that continually pops up, particularly after the Great Recession. Those businesses that did survive, I've been hearing more and more, probably the last year and a half or so, saying they just can't, there is no way they could do $15 an hour or $11 an hour, particularly when you get into border communities. And again, we're talking about some really small businesses. So there are a lot of ideas out there. Some people have talked about regional minimum wages. Some people, of course, would say, let's just let the feds take care of it. That way Illinois won't be this island that we are now in the Midwest. So there's lots of discussion on that. I don't know, nothing passed the General Assembly this past year. In fact, the Senate did pass a measure over to the House, but that bill did not move. Again, I anticipate that this issue is not going to go away, and if and when, and I'll let Leader Lang discuss if and when we get a budget, but that very well could be part of it. But the NFIB is opposed to raising Illinois' minimum wage. Prevailing wage, another issue that I know we share with school districts. Prevailing wage has traditionally always been big construction projects, building schools, building roads. I get it, it makes sense. There's a level that people want. If you're going to use state dollars, lawmakers have made it loud and clear that they want the labor to make a certain level based on their classifications. The problem, though, in the last, as I said, 17 years that I've been here, is that we have grayed that law so much that it's almost unrecognizable. It's so much more than large construction projects. I believe it was I want to say it was either the late 90s, early 2000s, organized labor inserted one word into the Prevailing Wage Act, and that word was maintenance. And so now, all of a sudden now, instead of just these big construction projects, now you're talking about snow removal, you're talking about landscaping. In one case, I have a member who installs alarm systems. Every time he goes into a school to test the alarm, if his guy's there for 10 minutes or an hour, it's prevailing wage. And that has really made it difficult for a lot of my members, again, small business owners who really want to do business with their school districts, with their local municipalities, with their counties. They're not interested in competing with organized labor on road building and all of that stuff. But they do a lot of the smaller jobs. And from what I hear from many of you, as we've lobbied with your team over the past several years, as well as the local governments, is that you guys can't get enough people to even bid on some of these smaller projects. Because it's too expensive. Some of my guys who do this kind of work are like, I'm not even dealing with that anymore. And I really don't think that that's what the prevailing wage law was meant to be. And so that was one issue that has really made it more difficult over the last several years. We have discussed in the past, part of the problem too is that on this issue in particular, there has been literally zero dialogue. Organized labor has said absolutely no discussion on this issue. We are not opening that act up, no way. Mike Tryon, who's a state representative from McHenry County, came down to Springfield like 2 or 3 years ago and tried to pass a threshold bill to say, okay, if projects are under a certain amount, I think it was $25,000, they would not be subject to prevailing wage. I mean, organized labor threw an absolute hissy fit. No way, absolutely not, we're not talking about it. So then Representative Tryon said, well, let's do a task force. Let's get the local governments and the small business and the school districts and labor to sit down and talk about how we can make this easier to use, better, all of that. And labor wouldn't even let that bill get out of the House Labor Committee, a task force bill. And so, that's what we've been going up against the last decade on this issue in particular. They want no discussion at all. And so it's kind of tough representing small business owners who, this is one of the top 5 issues I hear about, prevailing wage. And what's kind of scary is that they say the Davis-Bacon Act is easier to utilize, which is the federal prevailing wage law. They would rather have Davis-Bacon in place than what we have in Illinois right now. And I also, on the threshold issue, this is not anything that's crazy. 32 states have a threshold, some as high as 250,000 and some as low as 1,000. So we are not out of the mainstream in terms of trying to work with labor, work with the legislature to try to make the prevailing wage law work better. And again, Governor Rauner has something to say about that issue as well. His take is a little bit different. He wants to give more flexibility, or total flexibility, I guess, to local governments to decide if they want to use prevailing wage going forward. You know, I don't see that happening. I think it probably makes more sense to try to do some of the things that we would like to do in terms of a threshold, but we'll see where that goes. Workers' compensation, another, probably the number one issue I hear about from my membership in this state. We are the 7th highest when it comes to cost for workers' compensation. We used to be in the middle of the pack. And normally I don't really like to say, hey, let's be average. Let's be an average state, that'd be great. But in this case, it'd be great to be average. When you're the 7th highest, and when you hear from small business owners, particularly those, again, who live in border communities, and they look into Indiana, they look into Missouri, they look into other states, and are being told by their agents, if you move across the border, you can save, in some cases, hundreds of thousands of dollars. This is an issue that has got to be addressed. Now, we have, again, been around 17 years, sat through several negotiations on this issue, most recently 2011, and I give a lot of credit to then Governor Quinn, to Speaker Madigan, to President Cullerton. They made it very clear to organized labor that we were going to get a bill, and that's what it takes. It takes a push from the Democrat leaders to get business and labor to sit down and have meaningful discussions, not, you know, and then walk away. So we did have a bill in 2011. Unfortunately, it didn't go far enough. It moved the ball a little bit. We have seen some cost reductions, certainly not what we thought we would see or that we would like to see. And personally, I think that is because we did not address probably the number one issue out there, and that's causation. That is a word that if you listen to a politician long enough, particularly when running for office on the Republican side, you will hear, we have to change the causation standard, and most people are like, I don't even know what that means. And so in Illinois, we are what is termed an any cause state. And so, you know, if your injury has been determined to the workplace caused 1% of your injury, in Illinois, the employer's on the hook. They're on the hook for your medical, they're on the hook for any payout that might happen, any lingering disability. And so what we're talking about is trying to raise that threshold to a primary cause. Some people are saying 50%, so the workplace would have to be at least 50% responsible for the injury. We're not wedded to that. We would just like to get beyond any cause. Because workers' compensation costs, as I said, are very expensive. I really feel honest about this, I don't think I could find any of my members who would ever want to deny an injured employee who was legitimately injured on the job what they deserved. They want to get them healthy, and they want to get them back to work. Unfortunately, there's a lot of Saturday afternoon softball injuries that turn into Monday morning workers' compensation claims, and that is just the fact. I mean, I could tell you story after story that I hear from my members, but I won't go into all that detail. The fact of the matter is, again, listening to my membership, these are small business owners. Everybody loves small business. Let's grow small business. Well, that's what they're telling me they need. And so this is probably one of the top issues that Governor Rauner has taken on as part of his turnaround agenda. He has included language that would be a 50% causation standard. I believe both Florida and Missouri. I know Florida has a 50% causation. I think Missouri either has primary or 50. So it's, again, not out of, it's not crazy to think that we would have a primary cause in Illinois. And so part of why I want to address a little bit, because I'm not here as a Republican, I'm not here representing Bill Brady or the Republican caucus, I am here representing NFIB, and we have endorsed Governor Rauner's turnaround agenda. And part of it is because we feel strongly, as I think I laid out a little bit, the pendulum has swung too far to one side. We'd like to get that pendulum back in the middle. And I think much of what the governor has outlined would do that, and certainly from the business perspective. And so that benefits a lot of people. If we have a healthy economy, if we have a healthy business community, more people are going to go to work, more people are going to make more money, they're going to pay their taxes, and the state's going to have more money. We certainly know the state's a mess. I'm not going to get into all that, Leader Lang certainly knows a lot more about the budget and all of that stuff than I do. But I think that you're seeing this aggressive nature coming from the governor, coming from groups like NFIB and the Illinois Chamber and all the other business groups, because we have got to do something to change this state around, to turn this state around. Now, I'm not saying every idea that the governor has is 100% right, but we have to come together, much like we've done in the past on workers' comp and unemployment insurance, and figure this out for the good of the state. And I know a lot of the rank and file Democrats and rank and file Republicans are trying and talking to their leaders, trying to, let's push this forward. But I'm hearing that, it's probably not going to be until next year, which is really, maybe legislature should only meet every other year. Maybe we should have a 2-year budget. There's lots of things that I think a lot of people are scratching their head going, why do we need the legislature? We're living with a budget. 90% of the budget's being paid, and we don't have a budget. So it's kind of interesting. So anyway, those are some of my thoughts. Sir Leader Lang will have a different perspective, and I'd be happy to answer any questions when that is appropriate. So thank you.
Thanks, Kim. So next we're going to hear from House Democratic Deputy Majority Leader Lou Lang. First, I just want to put a few pieces of information out there for you from the school perspective. Prevailing wage is an issue that IASB has had as a position statement since the 1970s. We often work with the business community in the Capitol to try, because often school districts are the largest employer in their communities. Another thing is on the prevailing wage issue, we also participated in a study, I think last year, and we found that changing or tweaking prevailing wage could save districts millions of dollars. And of course, that's debatable. How exactly does that work? It's not a magic bullet to do one thing and fix this, but we definitely have supported the threshold bill, the $25,000, and we have heard a lot of concerns from school districts on that maintenance word. That is very costly for districts. In particular, that word has caused from the Department of Labor a lot of projects that districts didn't really think of prevailing wage for them to have to go back and pay that. Just one quick thing on minimum wage. So in districts, most everyone in a district makes above minimum wage. The concern isn't necessarily with the idea of the specific increase, but kind of the trickle down or trickle up effect that would create in a school district, because if someone is making $15 an hour right now and we increase minimum wage to $15, that person truly believes that their job is not a minimum wage job, that they are worth more than that, and they provide services more than a minimum wage job should provide. So then they are looking for an increase to make their salary above the minimum wage. So it's not necessarily that the minimum wage is going to increase salaries specifically in a district, but that it's going to be trickle down or trickle up, however you want to see it, and that it will eventually be costly to districts. So that's another issue we've definitely been keeping an eye on. Just a few things there from the school perspective. So I'd like to introduce Leader Lang. He has served in the Illinois House since 1988. He represents the 16th House District, which includes Skokie, Lincolnwood, Morton Grove, and portions of Chicago. He was promoted to the title of House Democratic Floor Leader in 1993, Assistant Majority Leader in 1997, and Deputy Majority Leader in 2009. Some might say he's a rising star. He is also the Niles Township Democratic Committeeman and the Executive Vice Chairman of the Cook County Democratic Party. Representative Lang serves on the Rules Committee and is the chairperson of the Substance Abuse Special Committee. And he is also an attorney, and we are grateful that he is here today and look forward to hearing what he has to share with us. So please join me in welcoming Leader Lang.
Thank you very much. I'm going to just stay here till the snow melts. And I have to say, Senator Brady would be appalled if he knew I was taking some of his time. It wouldn't go over real well with him. So good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. And I think many of the issues that have been outlined are important issues to discuss. And Kim is right. We have a slightly different perspective on those issues, but not entirely, you'll be happy to know. First, let me say a few words about these issues as they relate to the budget process. So some of you may be aware that the state of Illinois does not have a budget as of yet. Raise your hands if you're aware of that. I kind of thought so. Now, interestingly, the governor signed the education budget for whatever reasons he had, and I think they were important ones. He wanted schools to open this fall, and I know that many of you would have schools not open if the governor had not signed that budget. And that was important to have done. But now we have the rest of the budget, 90% of which is being paid out by court order. And that 90% is being paid out by court order based on last year's budget. A budget that needed to be cut because the income tax increase went away, and therefore we're paying out far more by court order than we would have paid out if we had an agreed budget. And I think there's some blame to go around on both sides of the aisle on that one. I would tell you that I think the most important reason that we don't have a budget yet is the governor doesn't want to have one. Now, I know that sounds political, but let me just tell you the facts. The facts are these. In February, the governor filed his budget. That budget called for draconian cuts all over the place. Higher education, 31.5%, and on down the line. That budget wasn't going to go anywhere, but he filed it. And after going through the spring session and having legislative hearings, appropriation hearings, the General Assembly passed a budget to the governor. That budget called for about $1 billion in cuts over the previous year, but was also out of balance. And we said it was out of balance. And we said, this budget reflects the values of the people of the state of Illinois based on hearings, based on evidence, based on what we hear out there. And that included the education budget, of course. We said this budget needs more revenue. The governor said, you're right. That budget needs more revenue. That budget's out of balance. He didn't say his budget was also out of balance. And rather than play tit for tat, let me just simply say this to you. You all are aware of the Constitution of the state of Illinois, and you're all aware that it provides for a line item veto for the governor. We put the budget on his desk. He had choices. He could have signed it, which we didn't expect him to do. He could have vetoed it in full, which he did, or he could have line item vetoed that budget. So if he wanted a budget, he could have taken the budget we put on his desk and made it look like his. He could have made any changes he wanted in that budget and said, I'm signing this. This is now the budget for the state of Illinois. But he chose not to do that, and he chose not to do that because he had agenda items. For us, on the Democratic side of the aisle, we believe those agenda items are non-budgetary related. Some would say to you, well, so what? But I think it's a big point. Because the budget, which everyone in the state of Illinois relies on, is sitting there being held hostage for many items which are political, and yes, many items on this list. Now, I'm not here to tell you that these items are not important. I'm not here to tell you that these are not significant, critical areas for discussion. Not that I agree with all the governor's points of view, but he is the governor, and these are issues that have been out there a while, and we should be discussing them. But to hold up the budget of the state of Illinois, to hold up all the money going to higher education and MAP grants for the kids that rely on it, and people who have mental illness and epilepsy, domestic violence shelters, mental health services, and go on down the line, to hold that up when the most important responsibility of Illinois government is to pass a budget, we believe is wrong. And we will continue to believe it's wrong. And so someone might say to me, when do you think you'll have a budget, Representative? And I think the answer to that question is as soon as the governor finds a way to declare victory and decides to have a budget. Because as I told you, we would have had a budget if he just simply made the changes he himself wanted to make in the budget. And by the way, when he vetoed that budget, he vetoed funding in that budget that was not even state funding. So there are all kinds of funds that we have to appropriate, including money we get from the federal government that is not part of the state budget process. And that funding was vetoed as well. And so throughout the course of the summer and fall, we've actually had to pass bills to fix that. And the governor said, yes, I think we ought to fix that. But he didn't have the foresight to deal with that in the first place. And so we have all sorts of social service agencies closing in the state of Illinois that rely on federal money, not even state money, that the governor allowed to languish. I'm going to discuss the items that Kim raised, but I find it curious, and I'm talking to school people here who have a stake in all sorts of issues regarding the business side of the ledger. And so I find it curious that for a governor who signed the education budget, we haven't heard anything from him about procurement reform. We have a bill, I'm one of the co-sponsors of this bill, along with Chief Sponsor Fred Crespo, that was brought to me by Roger Eddy from Vision 2020 to provide another way for you guys to all pool together to buy product, whether it be desks or pencils or any other hard goods that you have to buy. We have to have some procurement reform to accomplish that. There's a bill out there to do it. Governor didn't talk about those kinds of issues that would come right down to your bottom line. Haven't heard the governor talk much about school funding reform. I've heard certain legislators talk about school funding reform, but what could be more important to you than that? Many of you come from school districts that don't have the property tax base that, let's say, some of the North Suburban school districts do. Many of you are from North Suburban school districts or DuPage County or other places that have a good property tax base. And yes, there are school districts that need more cash. Some of the proposals that are out there, from my point of view, don't quite cut it. Because a proposal that takes money from one district and gives it to another district is not a good way to go unless you want to make all school districts look alike, sound alike, and be average. What we need to do is allow these school districts that have the wherewithal to continue to have the wherewithal and find the necessary resources to lift those up who need some help from the state of Illinois. I don't hear that coming from the governor. That should have been part of the turnaround agenda. That is an important issue for all of you. Then, governor wants to put a property tax freeze on all of you. A property tax freeze. So for the same governor who wants local government to decide about collective bargaining and prevailing wage, that same governor doesn't want local government to decide about property taxes. We have to have people in public office, not only just the governor, but everyone in public office, who have a consistent philosophy of government. That consistent philosophy must include who decides. We can't pick and choose and let Springfield decide some things because that's politically expedient, and then allow locals to decide other things because that's politically expedient. We either believe in local government making decisions on their own or we don't. This bifurcated system is not good for any of us. And so a proposal coming out of Springfield to artificially force your property taxes to be whatever Springfield decides what they want to be belies an effort to make education better all over the state of Illinois. So I think that's something you need to watch out for. So on minimum wage changes in this country and in the state over a period of years help build the middle class. And yes, some people want to raise it very far, very fast. And I don't think everybody in Springfield, even on my side of the aisle, is interested in that. I think there's an interest in a slow, steady increase that enables people to keep up with inflation and take care of their families so they don't become a burden to the taxpayers in other ways. The governor's proposal of 25 cents an hour over 7 years is not really much of a proposal. Because when you look at that, it doesn't really take the average Illinoisan who's going to be a minimum wage worker, whether it be today or 7 years from now, it doesn't really take them very far down the road. On the other hand, it's an important issue. The proposal in the city of Chicago to jump up to $15 an hour, and some say even $17 an hour, is something that will require some review. I even haven't signed on to that. Most of my friends on the Democratic side of the aisle haven't signed on to that. But it is important to note that 2/3 of Illinoisans in the last election said on the ballot that they believe the minimum wage should be increased. And they believe it should be increased in a little bit stronger way than the governor proposed in his message this year. And so, rather than pontifications, which many people in public life do about minimum wage, rather than taking the political and sticking it into the debate, we need to have real discussions from involving economists, involving local government officials such as yourself, involving legislators, involving the governor's office, involving some real experts, and taking the politics out of it and having a real conversation about what to do and how to do it, so that we don't throw the middle class under the bus in our effort to improve the bottom line of school districts and local government and people that and businesses around the state of Illinois. We recognize that a minimum wage that's too high is not so good for business. But when you politicize it and you make that a political agenda item and you just say the minimum wage, oh my God, what are we going to do? It's too high, and you do all this hand wringing, it becomes part of a Democratic playbook with one response or a Republican playbook with another response. And we don't need to discuss these important and significant issues about Illinois out of somebody's playbook. We need to discuss these issues in a real conversation. Prevailing wage, not really any different than the minimum wage conversation in terms of how to resolve it. We believe in reform of prevailing wage, but we don't believe in it as a political tool. And many think of it as a political tool. You'll find that people on my side of the aisle run around the state talking about how if we change minimum wage, it's going to ruin the middle class, and some agree and some don't agree. And people on the other side of the aisle will say, and business leaders will say, oh, this prevailing wage stuff is killing us, and we know that you have to write these checks, and we know that it's not always good for you. And yes, there are some silly results that come out of prevailing wage, some silly results that should be fixed, and people are willing to fix them. But they're not willing to fix them based on a backdrop that's all political. That is you're going to win or we're going to win, and we're going to help this group of people who fund our campaigns, or we're going to help that group of people that help our campaigns. We need to have a real conversation about prevailing wage, just as we do about minimum wage. Workers' compensation. As Kim told you, in 2011, we passed a reform bill. Some said it wasn't enough, but I don't think we have enough data to know. I don't think a few years is enough. The numbers have gone down, premiums have gone down, but I will say to you that they haven't gone down as much as we hoped they would. But very few people are looking at insurance companies as the culprit. All of you have to write checks to insurance carriers, whether it be your liability insurance, your health insurance, all kinds of insurance checks you write. And all of you are unhappy with the amount of money you have to pay insurance companies. Insurers hoard money so that they don't have to lower premiums. It's a simple fact. They call it reserves. And they put it aside, and they don't have to count it when they figure out their rates. And here in Illinois, there's been a lot of reserve hoarding, in my opinion. So when we talk about workers' comp reform, and yes, there's probably some opportunity for that. When we talk about workers' comp reform, we have to include insurers in this problem, because insurers are the ones that write the checks for the claims, and insurers are the ones to whom you write the checks for the premiums. And if they aren't involved in the conversation, then there can't be a legitimate conversation that gets to the bottom line. Now, some say, my goodness, look at Indiana, and their premiums are so much less. Well, they are less. Part of it deals with insurance companies. Part of it's deal not just with causation, but with actual benefits. So if your son or your daughter is a construction worker and they fall off of a construction beam 500 feet above the ground and they land on their head and they're quadriplegic, you want your grandchildren taken care of. These are people that get injured on the job and deserve the help that workers' comp will provide for them. In the state of Indiana, they don't get a living wage to be paid to them for the rest of their life. They don't get that. In Illinois, they do. Someone could argue, well, our benefits are too high. Fine, we can talk about the benefits. But to compare Illinois to Indiana, when Indiana is a state that just doesn't take care of their workers the way the state of Illinois does, I think it's wrong. Additionally, let's remember the reason workers' compensation came into play in the first place. Many, many years ago, before we had workers' compensation, everyone that got injured on the job sued their employer. And the courtrooms were flooded with all kinds of lawsuits. And then you would have to call in the lawyers, and then you would have to have debate, and then there'd be long lists of lawyer bills, and then there would be settlements, and these cases would all settle. It would be bad for employers, bad for the injured parties, only good for lawyers, which sounds good to me some days, but not for this purpose. And so we went to a no-fault system. You get injured on the job, you get paid from a schedule that's been agreed to. Now, some would say that that still needs some tweaking. Tweak away. You don't hear me saying, let's not tweak away. You don't hear me saying a guy who's totally drunk on the job that falls off of that beam should get taken care of by an insurance company for the rest of his life if the drunkenness was a cause of his injuries. Of course not. And so there are tweaks. But again, let's not make the political get in the way of reality. And let's not make the political get in the way of good public policy to protect workers in Illinois. And also, let's remember why we started workers' compensation in the first place. Employers and labor unions, for that matter, did not want to litigate thousands and thousands and thousands of cases in a courthouse. It's not good for the politics. It's not good for the system. It's not good for the economy of the state of Illinois. There's much more to talk about, of course. I'd be happy to answer your questions, but let me say this. I think members on both sides of the aisle are interested in a budget. Leaders are interested in a budget. I would argue maybe the governor isn't, but let's assume he is. He has to be at the table if there's going to be a conversation. But don't believe everything you read in the newspapers about what's going on here. Many of the newspapers would have you believe this is a big war between Mike Madigan and Bruce Rauner, and they just don't get along, so we don't have a budget. And they would have you believe they keep using the word stalemate, and they keep using the word impasse. Well, ladies and gentlemen, stalemate and impasse infer that we're actually talking about the budget. But we're not talking about the budget. I promise you this. Once they get in a room and actually talk about the budget, we'll be done in 72 hours. Because a budget is just math. Budget is just math. Whatever amount of money you have, whether there's going to be new revenue or not new revenue, that's calculable. And we'll have a number, and that's what we can spend. And once we have that number, we'll know what we can spend, and we'll have a budget. Not as hard as you think. Not easy, but can probably be done very rapidly. What is required is that both sides want to get in a room and actually discuss the budget. And I would just simply tell you, from my point of view, that as soon as the governor wants to have a budget, we'll have one. Thanks for having me. So let me just respond quickly. I couldn't have said it better than you, my friend. We believe that the middle class was built by collective bargaining as well, or at least had a lot to do with it. Certainly, small business that Kim represents employs more people than anybody. But collective bargaining has been an important tool to build the middle class. And I don't think you should look for the General Assembly to eliminate collective bargaining anytime soon.
Well, we don't have a position on that issue, so.
Sir.
Hi, Terry Waldron. I'm from Sparta, way down south, Jerry Costello country. I have a question about the small business club group.
Club. You too, you can be a member of the club.
Okay. I know you said you have members as small as 10 employees, but how large? Because I was surprised sometime to see some names thrown out that were members of that were considered small business, and they were what I thought were pretty big businesses.
Well, in terms of NFIB, we don't have a, if you're under this amount, you can join. If you're over this amount, it's based on whether you're publicly traded or not. But I can tell you, as I used, our average member in Illinois has 10 employees. So in general, we don't represent what I would consider, large corporations. And I think we get this question a lot. How do you define a small business? And I can tell you, ironically, the SBA, the Small Business Administration at the federal level, defines a small business as fewer than 500 employees. And we certainly don't subscribe to that. But in terms of our membership, I would say rule of thumb, I usually say under 50 is sort of representative of our membership. Now, do we have members that have, I can think of one off the top of my head in Aurora that has 150 employees. So, but we really are represent the very small.
Okay.
Good afternoon, Randy Tillman from Altamont, Southern Illinois. And one of the frustrations, I'm a board member, that I have each year is the requirement we have to review the prevailing wage, and I'm told that we have a choice but to vote for it. My question is twofold. Why, if we have to pass it, do we even have to act on it? And second, you mentioned the local control, and you mentioned the argument on tax caps, and I think that's a good argument, okay? But if we are really wanting to have local control, wouldn't that also fall under local control, that if we're gonna have prevailing wage, should that not be by area, by county? What's your thoughts on that? Because that is a frustration with our board, we've talked with other boards, the idea that we have to do something, and the idea that it's not normal in our area anyway.
So thank you for the question. My view is, and it may not be shared by everyone in the House Democratic Caucus where I hang out, but my point of view is that all issues ought to always be on the table. And so when people in local government are suggesting to us that there are some changes, some tweaks, we should bring people to the table and talk about them, as long as the tweaks are fair to both sides. So if one side is getting a tweak that benefits them, let's make sure that it's just not to stick it to the other side. And so if there's going to be substantial prevailing wage reform, let's make sure it's not in a way that lowers the standard of living for thousands of people or even hundreds of people in Altamont or anywhere else. So all I say is, we have a lot of serious problems in Illinois. They need to be resolved. They can't be resolved by pontificating. They can't be resolved by everybody going to their side and never agreeing. The only way you can agree on change is to sit down at a table and do it. So I would be one who would say we should sit down, but we should not come out of any of those meetings. First, we should not go into those meetings with a preconceived notion. Second, we need to go into those meetings with both sides saying, I'm willing to give a little, but I need something in return. And the third thing is, when we come out, we ought to lock arms and say, let's go in this direction. And we don't have enough of that going on in Springfield.
I would agree with that. And go back to my first question. Do you know why we have to vote on something that I guess it has to pass? Does any of you know of that?
It's my understanding that the locals have the opportunity to do their own survey of like work in their county, or I guess it's their county. But the state does it, so for the most part, everyone just adopts what the state comes up with for their locality. Now, as to why you have to adopt that, through ordinance, I don't know the answer to that, except it's part of the statute. I'm assuming at some point it has to do with lawyers, but I don't know. But I think you have a great point in the sense that what I hear from particularly parts of the state, downstate, that aren't heavily unionized. I'll use Quincy. Do we have anybody from Adams County? I grew up there, so I have a lot of friends there, a lot of members there. And when they look at the wage rates that they are given by the state for Adams County, there is no way we're paying a laborer $45 an hour with light work. And so the school board attempted to look into that and said, we're not going to adopt this rate. We want to know how you got to those rates. And almost immediately there were like 4 lawsuits filed against them by organized labor. And so we have said in the past, under previous administrations, particularly Quinn and Blagojevich, show us how you come up with these rates, because in Adams County they're convinced You're putting Peoria and Springfield union rates together and shoving it down Adams County's throat. And that's not right. It's supposed to be like work. And so under the Rauner administration, they are in the process of looking at that and trying to get a fair snapshot of what are real wages in those counties. Because the last thing you want, I'm quite sure, is people from Springfield going to Adams County and doing the work that local workers should get, whether you're union or not. The wage is the wage, but it shouldn't be driven up so high that the only people that can do it are union contractors from Springfield and Peoria. So I guess help is on the way. The Rauner administration is taking a look at that stuff from an administrative standpoint. I'm pretty sure they've frozen the prevailing wage rates. So whatever was in July is going to be that way for the year. And so they're trying to do some things administratively that make sense and are a long time coming.
Thank you.
Thank you. I know you know of the budget issues with the school districts too. It's just another challenge we've got to deal with, so thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Hi, Corey Conklin, board member from Williamsville, just outside Springfield. For one, thanks for supporting the turnaround agenda. Love the work that you guys do.
Thank you.
Second, something you can debate all day, but just kind of interested to hear a response. Mike Madigan has been in Springfield for years and years and years, and we've had a lot of gridlock and not a lot of progress. And I'm not going to say that the budget wouldn't be nice. Obviously, a budget would be great, but if he does give up that budget, what does Governor Rauner have to negotiate with? Not that it should be a negotiating tool, but what would you suggest that he do, and that actually Mike Madigan would work with him if he would pass a budget for his other agenda goals?
We have had non-budgetary issues included in budgets, but no governor has ever held the budget up over them. Every governor has an agenda, whether it be turn around or turn back the clock, as I like to call it. Every governor has had an agenda. I've served under several governors, starting with Jim Thompson. They've all had an agenda. They've tried to pass bills. Sometimes they're successful, sometimes they're not. But a governor is required to show some leadership, and a governor is required to prioritize the most important things in our state under our Constitution. Our Constitution says that the most important thing we have to do is pass a budget to take care of the people of the state of Illinois. Those other items are he's entitled to have them on an agenda. He's even entitled to hold up the budget over them, but he's wrong to do so. I would suggest he try to pass those things the old-fashioned way. Mike Madigan is just another politician in Springfield, public servant in Springfield. Some people like what he does, some people don't like what he does, but I will tell you this, no one in the history of Illinois government has had a stronger feel for the constitutional role of the Illinois General Assembly under our Constitution. Somebody's got to play that role. And much of the time when you read about things the speaker's for and the speaker's against, it has less to do with the policy than it does with the role of the legislature under the Constitution. And so we have an important role to play. And when Bruce Rauner became governor, he came from the business world. And from the business world, he would get into a boardroom with a bunch of board members or a bunch of middle management people, and he'd say, you do this, you do this, you do this, and you do this. And the next day, they would report to him that they did it or they fired. Bruce Rauner has come to Springfield with the notion that I am his middle management, that he gets to tell me what to do, get to tell me what to think, not just me, but the members of the General Assembly on both sides of the aisle. And that is not the role of the governor. The role of the governor is to be the partner of the Illinois General Assembly under the Constitution. He does not want to be our partner, he wants to be our boss. And so there's another governor that tried to be our boss. His name was Rod Blagojevich. I was just as unhappy with Rod Blagojevich as I am with Bruce Rauner, because they didn't or don't understand their role under the Constitution of the state of Illinois. We take that role that we have under that Constitution very seriously. And so we want to be his partners in government. When he became governor, sorry for the long answer to your short question, when he became governor, I had a meeting with him, and only one since. And when I had that meeting with him, I said to him, you know, because I'm thought of as a pretty strong partisan Democrat. Surprise. And I said to him, the election's over. I don't care that you're a Republican. I care that you want to be my partner in government. I had the same conversation with a Republican governor named George Ryan. George Ryan is the single best governor I've ever served under because he understood the role of the governor's office. He understood the role of the General Assembly, and he worked with us every day to try to improve Illinois. And we didn't agree on everything, but George Ryan got a lot of his agenda passed, even with Democratic majorities, because he worked with us. And when Governor Rauner chooses to work with us, you won't look at Mike Madigan as a speed bump. You'll look at Mike Madigan as the governor's partner in government.
Thank you.
I just have to add one little short thing. I think what you were alluding to is that one of the items that's sort of part of this negotiation is the fact that there's probably going to be some new revenue. And so I think there's a conventional thought out there that, well, that is all that the governor has to give to Democrats. And let's not forget, Democrats have a supermajority in the House and the Senate. We got to convince a whole lot of Democrats. First of all, keep all the Republicans and convince a whole lot of Democrats to help us with workers' comp reform, prevailing wage reform, minimum wage issues, knowing that one of their top constituencies, organized labor, is pretty much against us and all that stuff. So there is a thought, and again, I think the gentleman was alluding to, that if the governor just says, yeah, here's your tax increase, he has no leverage left to get through what he really wants to get through.
Wait. I just want to add a point or two.
Just, you got 5 seconds.
Yes, the Democratic Party has a long-term alliance with organized labor and some other groups, just as the Republican Party does with other groups. But we have said to organized labor, no, when they didn't want us to pass the last workers' comp reform bill. And we told organized labor, no here and no there. And we've told no to the trial lawyers, and we've told no to people when it's appropriate for us to do so. And so we are willing to come to the table on any issue. We are willing to have a conversation. We are not willing to allow these things to be politicized. And we don't want them politicized by our allies any more than we want them politicized by people who are not our allies. People who want to sit down and negotiate will find negotiating partners. Here's an example. I passed this year a piece of groundbreaking legislation on heroin and opioid abuse, the first of its kind in this country. And I passed it because it had Republican and Democratic sponsors. And I passed it over the veto of the governor because of that. In fact, out of 65 bills the governor vetoed this year, it was the only bill where there was an override of the governor. And it's become the law of Illinois. This is a bill that, despite differences on both sides of the aisle, passed the Illinois House of Representatives unanimously. We can agree on the attendance roll call or the prayer in the morning, and we passed this unanimously. And I'm not telling you this because it involves me. I'm telling you this because people who want to work together on important issues can accomplish them in a bipartisan way.
Okay, my turn. 2 questions. I'm going to bring it back to the education. You talked about the education budget that you passed before we went into the budget non-talking. How much pressure has the legislature and the governor's office executive felt by not having a budget? Are they feeling any pressure at all?
We, of course, feel not only pressure but responsibility to pass a budget, because the people that need our help the most are the people who are in that 10% that's not being paid out. As I said, people with epilepsy and mental illness and domestic violence shelters and homeless and down the line. And kids who need MAP grants to go to college. The pressure, however, was somewhat released with the education budget being signed, but almost more important, the fact that 90% of our budget is now being paid out by court order. So, for instance, the very first court order said we have to pay the state employees. Now, there were 2 conflicting court opinions on this. The actual fact is, the law says that without an appropriation, we can't pay anybody, but the federal courts have decreed that we do that. So they're the ones that have caused 90% of the budget to be paid out. Well, if 90% of the budget's being paid out, it releases some of the pressure. The release valve and the steam has been taken out of this. So the regular ordinary citizens who are not in that bottom 10%, people whose kids don't need MAP grants, people whose kids do not have epilepsy, people who do not have mental illness, don't really pay much attention to the budget process, and therefore there's not a political push to complete this process.
Which brings me to my second question. Next year, are they going to do the education bill, or are they going to go ahead and leave it in the general budget to turn the pressure up?
Can't answer that question. I can't even tell you about this year. If someone would say to me, when do you think this will be resolved? The answer is, your guess is as good as mine. I don't know, but again, and really not to be political, being as objective as I can possibly be, there will be a budget when the governor decides he wants to have one. That's why we don't have a budget.